Okay, it's already transmitting. We're broadcasting.
Yeah.
Okay, it's time to start.
So welcome to everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies, the CILAS at the University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt. I would like to welcome you to our winter lecture series, Balances of Development in the Americas, New Approaches and Thematic Lines, held in cooperation with our partner university, Universidad del Rosario in Bogota. My name is Miriam Leithander. I'm director of the CILAS and part of the organization team, together with Andres Jimenez.
We're not listening.
Okay.
We just stopped.
So you're not hearing me?
I was not hearing you, but now I am.
Now we do.
You didn't hear anything.
Did only Professor Feldmayer not hear me, or did everyone not hear me?
I can hear.
Okay.
Because when I was speaking, they hear me. So,
Yeah.
Andres, did you hear Miriam?
I do perfectly.
Okay. So perfect. So let's continue. I just for those who couldn't hear me, I just welcomed everyone and explained how this lecture series works at two places at the same time and also in a virtual space. So welcome again to everyone, whether you're joining us here in Eichstätt or in Bogota or in any other place. The concept of development, which was coined in close cooperation between Latin America and the United States, continues to guide the transformation processes of entire societies with the participation of the state, the market, international organizations, and other strategic actors. Initially associated with economic growth, during the post-war years, development today enjoys much richer definitions. Thus, far from being conceived as a neutral horizon of progress to be embraced by all nations in the bid to raise their socio-economic standards, development has been problematized by sharp insights from both academia and activism. The Americas have contributed intensely to the reflections of this research renewal of the concept of development. As recipients of multilateral development assistance and cooperation programs since the previous century, the countries of the region have become privileged cases for advancing debates on the modernizing agendas of the past, but also on their influence on the configuration of more contemporary issues, such as environmental sustainability, the strengthening of democratic systems, or the gaps determined by conditions of gender, class, and race. Our lecture series is part of this updating of interdisciplinary approaches to development as a field of debate. It aims to bring together academic voices from different disciplines to engage in broad reflections on the subject on the basis of concrete research paths. And in this way, we intend to draw up a critical balance between the modernizing enthusiasm of the past and the present challenges of development in Latin America. And before I hand over to Luis Peña, who will introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank all of those who have made this international lecture series possible. First of all, Andres Jimenez and Daniel Hernandez, who had the idea and took the initiative for this hybrid lecture series. Luis Peña, who invested a lot of time coordinating this event and still continues to do so. Claudia Velázquez-Schobert, who did and does important administration work, who is not here tonight. And all of you who are joining us in this first lecture, be it presentially or virtually. And I'm very much looking forward to our first lecture of this series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. So let me introduce Professor Henry. Professor Henry Wellmeyer is Senior Research Professor at the Autonomous University of Zacatecas in Mexico and Professor Emeritus of International Development Studies at St. Mary's University in Canada. He also holds the status of Emeritus National Research in National Research Council of Mexico. And through his remarkable career, Dr. Wellmeyer has focused on political economy of globalization and international development with a specialized interest in Latin America's development. His work has profoundly influenced critical perspectives on these subjects, and he is author and editor of more than 40 books. Among his many recent publications are Buen Vivir and the Challenges to Capitalism in Latin America, 2023, The Essential Guide to Critical Development Studies to 2021, and Latin American in the Portraits of Social Change, 2020. He's the editor of the Critical Development Studies series for Routledge, where he continues to challenge conventional approaches to sustainable development and for transformative social change. So for us, it's a pleasure, it's an honor to have you here, Professor Wellmeyer. So welcome, and we are looking forward to hear your presentation entitled The Post-Capitalist Transition at the End of Neoliberal Era, Lessons from Latin America. So please join me to welcome Professor Wellmeyer. Please, Professor Wellmeyer.
Okay. So I'm ready to speak.
Let me wait 1 second.
Okay.
I will do something here. Okay. Okay. Okay, Professor, you can start to speak.
Okay. You are ready for me then?
Yes. So please go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you, Louise, for that introduction and for the invitation to open your research center's lecture series this year. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you. And also good afternoon or early evening to those who are participating in this event either in person or virtually. I have prepared, as you can see, I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation to facilitate understanding perhaps of my accent, which in addition to Canadian English, which I have used for the past 50 years, Australian English, since I grew up in Australia, and possibly traces of Dutch, since I was born in Holland, although I can't speak the language, and even possible traces of Spanish, since I lived and worked in Ecuador in the 1960s. And since 2004, I have been working part year each year in Zacatecas, Mexico, as a research professor in development studies. Today, in this lecture, I propose to present, what happened here? To present and briefly discuss various issues that are currently the subject of academic and political debate regarding what we might term the political economy of capitalism or capitalist development. In the neoliberal era, in the neoliberal current era, my presentation on this debate focuses on Latin America, which provides a sort of window that allows us to look into what's happening all over the world with regard to what we could describe as the development and resistance dynamics of extractivism or extractivist capitalism. But that is happening with particular force and relevance in Latin America, according to some, the epicenter of extractivist capitalism. Which Latin America provides us important lessons as to how best to respond to these developments in the context of a multidimensional crisis of global proportions that is threatening to push the world capitalist system to and beyond its limits, with very grave implications for humanity. At issue in this presentation is the project of constructing a pathway in the transition towards an alternative system, an alternative future based on a more inclusive and sustainable model of development, as the Aymaran people of the Andes in South America have it, an alternative future, a better way of living and being in this world in social solidarity and harmony with nature. The reference here to extractivism is to a particularly destructive form taken by capitalism today on the periphery of the world system. That is the capitalist development of the forces of economic production released by foreign direct investment in the extraction of the natural resources, the patrimony of the developing societies on the periphery of the world system. And the exportation of these resources, such as fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas, and industrial metals and minerals, as well as agri-food and agri-forest products, which are exported in primary commodity form, that is, with little to no processing or value added, importing them into capitalist markets with the aim of generating mega profits, windfield profits derived from the super exploitation of both labor and nature in the development process. A strategy that has an inescapable side product in the systemic propensity towards crisis. That's the direct result of this model of development. Based on the destruction of the environment, the livelihoods in particular of the indigenous communities found on the extractive frontier in the countryside, in Latin America and elsewhere on the periphery. And this is not to mention the global climate crisis. The term development in this context can be understood in two ways. First, it can denote programs, policies, and actions designed to improve the lives and social conditions of a defined or targeted population. A project that has a long history, but to all intents and purposes, we can trace back to the late 1940s in the post-war era, an era which included, among other things, three important developments. One, the construction of the Bretton Woods system, a system designed for global governance, composed of the World Bank, the IMF, as well as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which in 1995 took form or was converted into the World Trade Organization. An organization that was designed to return the world towards a policy of free trade capitalism, which was a system that collapsed in the late 1920s, resulting in what we know as the Great Depression. This Bretton Woods system was designed to consolidate capitalism as a world system, together with the United Nations system, a system formed to the purpose of bringing about global peace, which is a required condition and an ancillary of development. The second feature of this post-war period was the end of European colonialism and the dissolution of what remained of the British-led empire, both of which had succumbed to powerful forces of resistance mounted and mobilized by the economically backward countries on the periphery of the world system, in what would later be described as the Global South. We are referring here to countries that at the time were seeking to liberate themselves from the yoke of European colonialism. The third feature of the post-war period is the construction of a project of international cooperation for development, which is a project advanced by the officials of the world's leading economic powers that had won the war and that were now concerned to prevent the former colonies from falling prey to the siren call of socialism, represented at the time by the Soviet Union, to ensure that these developing countries would pursue their project of national development within the institutional and policy framework of the world capitalist system, rather than socialism or communism. This project gave rise to International Development Studies, IDS in short, an area of academic research and study focused on social and development programs of assistance to the economically backward countries in what would later be described as the Third World and later yet the Global South. The program of international cooperation advanced by the rich advanced capitalist countries of the Global North, such as the United States, Canada, and Germany, among others, included the rather mythical idea that poor peoples, the global poor, would one day be able to enjoy the ways of the life of today's rich countries. An idea that was used to mobilize action by people on the periphery of the system and lead them to accept the enormous sacrifices, such as the destruction of their traditional culture, as well as the physical environment, the habitat of diverse peoples and societies in much of the Third World, which reinforced the unsustainable nature of the dominant development model, which is predicated on the workings of capitalism, the world capitalist system. Thus, the imaginary of success and happiness and the alleviation and reduction, if not the eradication of poverty, constructed by agencies and officials of the Global North, were predicated on and led to, among other unsustainable practices, the drilling of the seabed and the tar sands to extract oil and the infiltration of chemicals into geological layers to release natural gas, as well as the excavation of large-scale craters in the earth to extract minerals and metals, such as copper contained in the soil, as well as large-scale land grabbing for financial speculation and the production of agrofuels. These conditions were, we might note, the price that the poor, the global poor, and the developing countries would be expected to pay for admission into the neoliberal world order. This was the concept of development that took form and was shaped in academic circles, where the study of international development was advanced with an understanding of development as the outcome of actions taken in terms of or with reference to a strategy, one strategy or another, the result of actions taken and policies implemented in furtherance of an idea as to how best to improve the social quality of life or the social conditions of a targeted population. Development here is understood as actions taken to advance an idea, that is, a strategy. But we also have a different understanding of development, defined or understood not as a strategy, but as a process. That is the outcome not of actions in service of an idea, but of structural forces generated by the workings of a system, specifically the capitalist system for expanding the forces of economic production, a system based on a rather unequal exchange of labor power for a living wage, which is to say the capital-labor relation, a relation of economic exploitation and political conflict, a relation that is reproduced at the international level in relations among nations on a north-south divide, which was conceptualized by Lenin at the turn into the 20th century as imperialism, but that in the contemporary context we understand as an international division of labor based on extractivism. In other words, extractivism. What Lenin defined as imperialism, we now define as extractivism. In fact, we can trace out different forms or permutations and advances in this process, understood in structural rather than strategic terms. We can define this as capitalist development. With reference here to the evolution of capitalism, the capitalist system, from an initial phase of European colonialism and mercantilism at the end of the 15th century, a phase characterized by dispossession of the indigenous population, oppression of that population, and genocide, and by what we could describe as imperialist extractivism, based as it is on the dispossession of the direct producers and the communities on the extractive frontier, expropriation of their land, effected by both legal means and, when necessary, with violence, as well as the appropriation of the wealth of natural resources. And the transfer of this wealth, the repository of natural resources extracted from the land and from the indigenous territories and plantations set up in subjugated areas of the Americas and the Caribbean, as the West Indies, and of course also the East Indies, that is to the center of an emerging empire and the world system. So we can describe this development process as imperialist extractivism, as opposed to capitalist extractivism, based as it is on the subjugation on the original indigenous communities and expropriation of their land and embedded natural resource wealth. This development process, which involves 300 years, took 300 years of colonial rule and imperialist exploitation, was followed by a succession of development cycles, each generating new forces of resistance, which helped shape subsequent developments. I don't have time to trace out the history of this development process, take too long. But for those who might be interested, one could read the background paper that I did prepare for this talk. Just send me an email, look for and find and send me an email, and I will send you this paper, which goes into more detail into the evolution of the capitalist system and the history of these development and cycles, each associated with a different form of resistance. So let me please fast forward from the 19th century to the current neoliberal era, which was opened up in the 1980s with the institution of a new world order based on a belief in the virtues of free market capitalism and a policy of agenda of structural reforms such as globalization, privatization, and deregulation, market deregulation, as well as liberalization. That is, the lifting of restrictions imposed by the welfare development state in the post-war era. These structural reforms facilitated and led to, in the early, in the 80s, this is, led to the destruction of the forces of agricultural and industrial production built up in peripheral regions in countries such as Mexico and Argentina in Latin America, which in turn resulted in, among other things, the formation of what I would describe as a semi-proletariat of landless rural workers, who many of whom define themselves as peasants, but they constitute a semi-proletariat of landless rural workers, which served as a sort of reserve army of surplus labor that is used to service and to replenish the labor markets of the capitalist system in the North, in the global North. And it also resulted in a massive inflow into Latin America of extractive capital. That is the money or financial resources that is invested in the large-scale acquisition of land and the intensive production and extraction of natural resources such as fossil fuels, which provide the energy to fuel modern industry and transportation, as well as industrial metals and minerals that are currently in very high demand in capitalist markets, which of course is a vital factor in the construction of a new industrial and energy policy required in the search for a pathway towards what has been described as a post-extractivist, post-development, and post-capitalist transition. I hope people are still following me because I can't I can't see my own slides. We should be up to slide 13, Louise. These non-renewable natural resources mobilized by extractive operations such as mining, drilling, and harvesting are generally exported in primary commodity form with little to no processing to add value to the products, which is a process that generated enormous mega profits for the corporations in the extractive sector and the commodity traders, the big commodity trading houses, which accumulated enormous windfield profits in the profits of export sales of these commodities. Just in the first 5 years of the commodities boom, which took place from 2003 to 2012, a 10-year commodity boom, just in the first 5 years of this boom, the commodity traders, a few commodity trading houses, gain, not earned, gain up to 250 billion US dollars. This is just over the first 5 years of the commodities boom. In recent years, the magnitude of this accumulation and profit-making process has reached absolutely staggering proportions, as reflected in part, in a small part, in the growth of the number of billionaires worldwide. According to Forbes, today, 2,781 billionaires who together dispose of more income and wealth, this top 1%, than 40% of the bottom part of the population. In the aggregate, the value of the financial assets of this class, this billionaire class, is today well over $14 trillion, which, as I said, is more than the wealth disposed of by the bottom 40% of the world's population. 4 billion people, that is, close to one half of whom are still classified as poor, unable to meet their basic needs. And this obscene concentration of wealth, accentuated by the development dynamics of extractivism, was solidified over the course of the COVID pandemic and the system-wide multidimensional crisis of global proportions. When I say multidimensional, this includes social, economic, political, environmental, etc. All while the global poverty remains mired at pre-pandemic levels, impervious to the concerted efforts of the World Bank and other financial institutions or development agencies to redress the problem of global poverty. After all, it's difficult to eradicate a problem or reduce global poverty with policies, with World Bank policies that are fundamentally designed for the production and reproduction of poverty. So any gains made in the war against poverty in the last 3 decades have been the result of actions taken and policies implemented by progressive governments, by governments in the progressive cycle in Latin America. It's clearly evident that the global capitalist class and even parts of the so-called global middle class, which has shared in the fruits of economic growth, has appropriated a grossly disproportionate share of the wealth generated in the process of global capitalist development, the economic growth process, while the working classes and both the urban and rural poor, together with the communities on the extractive frontier in the countryside, have had to bear the exceedingly heavy social and environmental costs of this development, all without sharing in any of the benefits. This is clearly not development, or development can best here be understood as underdevelopment. Significantly, this development process also generated new forces of resistance that replaced the resistance of the labor movement and the movement for national liberation and revolutionary change formed in the 1950s and 60s in Latin America. Movements, all but one of which, FARC in Colombia, which still managed to continue operations until 1917, they were all defeated and destroyed by a combination of 3 state-led strategies. 1, welfare-oriented social reforms. 2, rural development programs, local development programs. And 3, the projection of armed force. When these development options, development strategy did not work to contain these revolutionary forces of change, the local state, Latin American state, as a proxy for the imperial state, projected armed force, tried to basically, in fact, destroyed and defeated these revolutionary social movements by the use of armed force. In the 1990s, in the wake of this development, there emerged a new iteration of peasant movements mobilized by what was left of the peasantry after decades of capitalism. That is the mass of dispossessed rural landless workers, many of whom were forced to migrate to take what could be described as the development path out of rural poverty offered by the Agency of International Cooperation. This path, development path, refers essentially to migration and labor. By the end of the decade, the 1990s, that is, these movements, these peasant movements in Latin America had helped bring about a generalized discontent and with neoliberalism and the rejection of the neoliberal policy agenda in certain policy circles on the center left of the political spectrum, creating conditions that in the new millennium, in the last couple of decades, led to a progressive cycle in Latin American politics, a turn to the left, which coincided with a primary commodities boom on the world market. This development has been described as a pink tide of progressive regime change that rejected the neoliberal policy agenda and sought to bring about a more inclusive and therefore sustainable form of development based on inclusionary state activism, not the work of the free market, and what is described by Cepal as neo-developmentalism, as opposed to the developmentalism of the immediate post-World War period. This neo-developmentalist approach is based on a policy of poverty reduction and neo-extractivism, which is to finance this poverty reduction agenda with the additional fiscal revenues derived from commodity exports. So this basically implicated these progressive states into the non-progressive agenda related to the environment. So basically, in this progressive cycle, 2002-2012, the reduction of the rate of poverty on average in this regime of 40% reduction was the result of this neo-development strategy, which opened up by the left of center progressive regimes, which opened up these left of center progressive regimes to the contradictions of extractive capitalism, including a propensity towards crisis that we already mentioned, a massive increase of social inequalities in the distribution of wealth and incomes worldwide, devastation of the environment, and the destruction of the livelihoods and the habitat and forced out-migration of indigenous communities on the extractive frontier. And this is not even to talk about the climate crisis. This brings me to a point on which I will soon conclude my presentation. The formation of what some theorists in Latin America, in particular David Barkan, a political economist and environmentalist who works in Mexico City, what Barkan and others have described as a force for transformative or revolutionary change, with particular reference here to the resistance mounted against extractivism, against the extractive operations of multinational corporations in the extractive sector, and the challenge to the capitalist world order mounted by the indigenous communities on the extractive frontier. as Barkin and other colleagues in the network of critical agrarian studies and critical development studies, a network of which I am a part. And in fact, this network includes a number of activist scholars in Germany, such as Glocon, a group headed by Christina Dietz and Bettina Engels at the Free University of Berlin. They have argued that these communities on the extractive frontier, mostly indigenous, constitute one of the most powerful forces of resistance today in the search for a pathway in the post-extractive or post-capitalist transition. That is, in the building of a post-capitalist world of sustainable and inclusive development and social and environmental justice. This resistance movement today, in the process of building a post-capitalist world, is still in its early days, in its infancy or adolescence, you might say. But as with the systemic crisis of capitalist development, it too has already reached global proportions. Although its epicenter, according to Barkin and colleagues, is Latin America, with reference here to the challenge to capitalism, to the capitalist system in its latest phase of development, that is extractivism, that is mounted by among other organizations, the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico, and other farming and indigenous communities on the extractive frontier. Secondly, by the peasant movement that I referred to earlier, particularly in the form of a struggle of the dispossessed rural landless workers such as Via Campesina, which is today's an international amalgam of peasant organizations comprising of, at last count, 180 local and national organizations that represent an estimated 200 million small farmers and self-defined peasants from around the world in 81 countries across the Americas and the Caribbean, as well as Africa, Asia, and Europe. So as I said, the resistance has become not only internationalized, it's become global. The class and territorial struggle of these organizations and communities on the extractive frontier, if and when they might coalesce into a global movement, unify into a global movement, will constitute undoubtedly one of the, if not the most powerful force of transformative change in the building of an alternative future in a post-capitalist world. This resistance does not just take the form of collective action and protest against exploitation of labor and nature. A class and a territorial struggle against the destructive impact of extractivism on livelihoods, as well as the violation of the territorial rights of indigenous communities. But significantly, it takes the form of the construction of an alternative model of local development. For example, an alternative model of agriculture that advanced by Via Campesina, based on local development, food sovereignty, and eco-socialism. This is a model advanced by Via Campesina. And we have then the construction of an alternative post-capitalist future, an alternative way of living being described by the indigenous intellectuals in the Andean countries of Bolivia and Ecuador as buen vivir, which is to live well in social solidarity and harmony with nature. The progressive regimes formed in these countries in the first decade of the new millennium enshrined the right to live well in Bolivia and Ecuador, that is, to live well in solidarity and harmony with nature in the constitution of what is described as a plurinational and multi-ethnic state. I'll end on this point, or perhaps a short concluding statement. The major concern in these debates that I refer to, debates that surround the political economy of international development is to find a pathway towards an alternative future based on inclusive and sustainable development, which requires a move beyond neoliberalism and the neoliberal policy agenda in the search for social and environmental justice. We might call this post-development or post-extractivism or the green transition in regards to the global environment, based on policies of sustainable and inclusive development or neo-development. But all these efforts in the search for an alternate future are in vain if we don't move beyond capitalism. This is because no matter how humane or palatable one can make capitalism through programs of sustainable and inclusive development, we can't escape the fundamental fact that the incessant accumulation of capital is predicated on the exploitation of labor and nature and impoverishment, unavoidably so. They say that if you put a frog in water and slowly heat the water slowly by degrees, the frog won't feel pain, won't realize that it is dying, that it's being killed. It's certainly a more humane or more palatable form of killing than ripping off the skin or pulling it apart, as often happens in the capitalist system. But the fact is, you can't put escargot on the menu of gourmet restaurants without killing frogs. You can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs. You can cook it first and later season it, but you still need to break the eggs. So it is with capitalism or extractivism. That is the extraction of natural resources from the land and the habitats of indigenous peoples and communities to the purpose, and with alternative progressive policies of sustainable and inclusive development, without the exploitation of workers and damaging the environment. The only escape from the contradictions of capital development is to move beyond not only neoliberalism, but to move beyond capitalism, something that is well understood by the indigenous communities on the extractive frontier. What we're referring to, of course, is socialism, but a new type of socialism. What in Venezuela was referred to as the socialism of the 21st century, which presumably includes the construction of social and solidarity economies within the institutional framework of socialist policies at the national level. But the agency are these local communities. We might call this community or communal development. In this context, poverty reduction is a laudable aim. Progressive policies are much preferable to the forces and policies pushed by the far right, the authoritarian populist movement that is emerging both in Europe and in Latin America, and in the United States with Donald Trump, and welfare capitalism, as in much of Europe. It is preferable to corporate capitalism or extractivism. But make no mistake, capitalism, no matter how deformed or humanized, is still capitalism. The only way out of the systemic crisis of capitalism and extractivism, which in recent years has reached global proportions, is to move not only beyond neoliberalism, as I said, but beyond capitalism. And this can only happen, or will only happen, by unifying the forces of resistance in the arena of electoral politics, in the countryside, and the extractive frontier. Anyway, I will end on that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Henry Meyer. We hear you well. Thank you for this very interesting insight. It's a great synthesis of what has been debated in Latin America, especially from one perspective, the critical perspective of development studies. And yeah, that will now is the time to receive some comments or questions from the persons that are connected. Have 17 persons connected, and I guess 17 persons also here in presence and in Eichstätt and Bogota also. I see a couple. I see a nice group. Okay, so I open the floor for your comments, for your questions to Professor Weltmeier. Here, there is one question.
Yes, as currently there's a meeting in Russia, BRICS meeting. So using this situation, I would like to hear about your opinion. What do you think about this BRICS movement? Is maybe this will contribute to generate some resistance to the general capitalist system that we have now in the Western part, or it is only what do you expect from that?
Okay, this organization, you're referring to the BRICS?
BRICS, yes.
Yeah.
Professor Weltmeier,
Okay, so that would include China and Russia, right?
Yes, China, Russia,
And South Africa
and South Africa
and Brazil.
and Brazil.
Well, as I mentioned, to resolve the current crisis, one has to move beyond capitalism. And BRICS does have the political potential to construct a pathway out of capitalism towards a new type of socialism. It has the potential, but it's hard to know if it can actually escape the contradictions of the capitalist system, particularly in regards to extractivism, because a number of these governments are still very much, let's say, oriented towards extractivism, towards not. Of course, there's nothing wrong with the extraction of natural resources for the purpose of economic growth or development. What is wrong is the use of this process of extraction to accumulate capital, to generate profits. In other words, when based on foreign investment. China, for example, is very heavily engaged in the foreign investment in the natural resources in Latin America. And so generating a lot of the same contradictions and problems of US foreign based foreign investment. So it's hard to know how far they can go, because if they become too, let's say, connected to the extractivist agenda, there is no way they, even though they can bring about a more inclusive form of development policies, which is necessary to bring about an inclusive and sustainable form of development. The key issue is, and the question is, can they escape the problematic of or the contradictions of extractive capitalism? Because a lot of these governments, they are not opposed to capitalism. They're simply looking at a more humane or even a more efficient form of capitalism, but not socialism. So that is why people like myself tend to think or to argue that the more likely force for progressive change is to be found at the level of local development involving the agency and the resistance of the communities on the extractive frontier, that they constitute probably the most powerful force of resistance to capitalism today.
Thank you, Professor Wellmeyer. So we're going to gather some questions here, and then we're gonna hear your responses to these questions. I have here one person. No, no, Maria. You, Andres?
Related to the first one, so okay.
Okay. We have one question here from Maria. I don't know if Andres has some questions on your side, but we can start with Maria.
Should I go?
I guess that will works.
Okay.
Professor, you tell me if you hear the question, please.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Professor, for the presentation. And my question is about the concept of imperialism and the connection with the concept of extractivism. In a certain point of your speech, I see the mention of this connection, but I would like that you could speak a little bit more about the connection between the both concepts.
Okay, I didn't quite capture it all. Luis, can you briefly summarize the question?
The connection between the concept of imperialism and extractivism.
Yeah, the relation between imperialist and extractivist concepts, which is the connection, the relation between these two concepts that you mentioned.
Between extractivism and what?
And imperialism and extractivism.
Okay, okay.
One question.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned in the construction of in the early stages of the construction of the world system, you have the imperialist project of basically expropriating the resources of the population and the communities in the Americas and elsewhere, and not for the purpose of capital accumulation, but for the purpose of maintaining the livelihoods of the aristocracy and the monarchy. So in other words, it was the actions of the European state, the monarchical state, seeking to exploit the resources and the population in the new world in order for its self-benefit. That is imperialism. Okay, imperialism today is basically understood as actions taken by the state in support of capitalism. In other words, it's the state that creates the conditions that facilitate and secure the advance of today of extractivist policies. So the whole extractivist agenda was based on policies implemented by the state in the 1980s in the so-called neoliberal era. There are people who argue that today the capitalist system does not require the state anymore, that it relies more on the actions and the support of multinational corporations. So the corporations are more powerful than the state, and the state has reduced relevance. But we argue strongly against that. Capitalism is a process of development based on economic exploitation of labor and the environment. Imperialism then is the policy of advancing the capital development process securing the conditions that that will allow capitalism to go forward. Extractivism, you notice that from the very beginning, both the imperialist project and today the capitalist project is based on extractivism, which means not just resource extraction, but resource extraction as a modality of capital accumulation. So as I said, the problem is not to extract natural resources for the purpose of economic growth. Development requires natural resource extraction, but it does not require extractivism. In other words, this resource extraction should be for the purpose of, let's say, development, improving the condition of the population, not the accumulation of capital. So when we say extractivism today, we are referring to a capitalist project and a capitalist agenda to extract resources from the peripheral areas in order to accumulate capital and generate profits for the international capitalist class. So they're connected, but they're different concepts. Yeah, you have to distinguish between capitalism and imperialism. A lot of scholars, like Marxists, make the mistake of confusing capitalism with imperialism, looking at them as interchangeable, as two sides of the same coin. In a way, it is, but capitalism and imperialism has distinct dynamics. So by imperialism, we're referring to the state, actions of the state. By capitalism, we are referring to the agency of capital, the capitalist class. They're connected but different. Extractivism, of course, is the policy of extracting natural resources to benefit not the population, but to benefit the investors.
Okay, thank you, Professor. There was plenty of questions that Andres there, and there is also a question in the chat from Emilio. So while you prepare the questions, Andres, I will read the questions from Emilio Nudelman. He is in Mexico currently.
Okay.
He said, I have one question. It is possible to certain resistance practices could serve to weaken the state, thereby benefiting transitional capital and extractivism, even if they express narratives against it? I am especially thinking on those resistance practices from micropolitics that dismiss macropolitics. How do you think we could work with this resistance in order to build true, genuinely inclusive, sustainable development? So this is the question. Allow me, Professor, to gather more questions from the side of Bogota, and then you can take notes of the questions. So maybe
Okay.
there are questions that have commonalities. And so, Andres, let's hear your questions.
Okay, thank you, Luis. First of all, I want to thank Professor Bettmeyer. We have here a group of very curious and eager students, 15 students we have here in the framework of our course about the history of development. And we have some questions from the students. I have a question myself, but I want to give time for their questions first. So who wants to start? Elias, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I have a question relating to the space of this post-capitalism, because as you talked in the conference, you talk about the rural areas and the indigenous people. That means that the post-capitalism, at least in this presentation, can be seen only can have the space only in these places. But also I have the question like it can have also space in the urban society, like in the cities or something like that. I mean, that isn't the case, wouldn't be like a little contradictory taking into account the inclusive factor, because it only has a space with the rural areas and the indigenous people. will mean that it will exclude other people that are not from these groups from to have part in this space for the post-capitalism quest.
Okay, this was the first question. Sebastian, please, can you come to the front so that Professor Bettmeyer can see you as well as the other participants in the conference?
Thank you. It is a imagining question. Do you think that at some point in human history, economic development in terms of wealth will be equipped in the face of people's social conditions? I say this by imagining a world where we have all have the same economic basis to be able to develop in society. Or are we inevitable trapped in economic development that favors a few and harms many? Thank you.
Okay, Nicolas, do you have a question? Or
I have a question.
okay, Nicolas, please.
Thank you, Professor. My question is, if you can talking more about the idea of capitalism in crisis, because here in the conference, I think that it's just the capitalism transform the form that we knew of the form that we have to understand the capitalism itself, because it's just the transform of the topics and the transform of the types that the capitalism have to transform the economy activities in the world. So you can profundize in that topic, please.
Okay. Do we have time and space for another question, or should we wait and maybe make a second question round? What do you think, Luis?
Let's hear your questions. Let's hear your questions, and then I see some connections in your questions. So,
anyone else? Okay, so I'm going to ask my question. So in your conference, you told us that different kinds of development beget different kinds of resistance. And I think if I understood you well, that means that you can't always impose a certain model of development without provoking a resistance from the people you are supposed to develop. But you also talked about the reshaping of development as a result of this resistances. So the question would be, if resistance leads to the reshaping of development, can we expect maybe that post-development or post-capitalist developments will beget not new forms of old development, so to speak?
hey, Professor Belmaya, did you hear?
Okay. Okay, maybe I'll start answering some of these questions.
You can start.
Because I find it hard to take notes, so I'm not sure how well I've captured the gist of the different questions, but let's see. In terms of the first question, the problem is, the central problem is a political one, is how to combine and unify different forces of resistance. Like the resistance provided by the communities on the extractive frontier is, even though they're very powerful, the forces of resistance, they have a very limited scope and impact, because it's very hard to, let's say, to generate results beyond the local communities. And this is why a lot of the local struggles remain local. they're hard to bring together. Among the peasants, in the question of the peasantry, they have succeeded much more than the indigenous communities in internationalizing their struggle. And basically, the peasant movement is more powerful, it mounts more powerful force of resistance than the indigenous communities, precisely because they've been able to form alliances, intra-regional, cross-regional alliances, which is absolutely an essential condition for basically moving from challenging capitalism. And not only alliances within the agricultural sector, but alliances with organizations in the urban centers and certain political organizations, like on the political left. What we have here is different forms of class struggle. We have the struggle of peasants against the who are opposed to the neoliberal agenda, and also the need to reconnect to the land, etc. And we have the struggle of indigenous communities that are trying to regain respect for their territorial rights, and they have a very difficult struggle, but it's a struggle which is very difficult. You find that the left, the political left in the urban centers, have not found a way or have any interest in working with. They provide ideological support, but no effective support of the indigenous communities and their struggle. And that has to change. The left at the moment is failing to not only to unify, but failing to connect with the struggle on the extractive frontier, and even the peasant movement. So we have three different struggles, three different class struggles. We have the struggle which is reflected in the arena of electoral politics. Let's say like today in Latin America, also in Europe, you have the struggle between the progressive forces that are committed to a more inclusive and sustainable form of development. Then you have on the right, on the far right, you have this sort of authoritarian approach to populism, right-wing populism, as reflected in Milei, the current president of Argentina, Bolsonaro, etc. These are people that are populists, but it's a very right-wing authoritarian form of populism. And in Latin America, we've had this kind of dialectic of electoral politics, this sort of series of left and right turns. A left turn in 2003, then a right turn in 2015, and another left turn in 2012, 20. And more lately, you even have a turn to the left in Colombia and Chile, neither of which had participated in the first left turn. So it's very difficult to see what's going to happen here, or what how effective the left can be to not only to unify with other forces of resistance, but to constitute a credible force of resistance itself. At the moment, the left in Latin America has not demonstrated this capacity to mobilize the forces of resistance in different sectors of society. And without that, there can be no progress. We just be going left and right to left, etc. Anyway, that's the big problem, is how to unify three different struggles, bring them together, because the struggle of indigenous communities and the peasants can only be advanced by this forces on the center left to basically not only provide support for their struggles, but to gain power, control of the state, and to institute with this state power and sort of the infrastructure for a socialist form of development, because the resistance in the local level can't go anywhere unless it has unless it's able to connect with the force of resistance in the political arena, with the center left in control of a progressive state to implement progressive policies, which then provide a framework within which the struggles of indigenous communities and the peasants can prosper, can do better. So that is the problem, how to unify these different struggles. This also relates to the second questioner about where the rural areas fit in the struggle, because obviously most these peasant organizations and indigenous communities, they do not have the power and the capacity and the means to challenge capitalism. The force of capitalism is just too great. That's why they have to unite with the political left, which is basically an urban force. On the question of capitalism in crisis, this is a debate. Some people think that the system is not in crisis, although it's very difficult to argue that there's no environmental crisis, that the environmental crisis is the result of capitalist development, this incessant need to accumulate. Within a capitalist framework, there is no solution to this contradiction. So there's definitely an environmental crisis, but there's also a social crisis in the sense that that capitalism is creating a polarization between the rich and the poor, which is of unheard of proportions. And that polarization will make it difficult to stabilize the system. Capitalism, unfortunately, they can't help it. It's so organized, capitalism, that it has to essentially generate profits that can be invested in not in human development or inclusive development, but in basically in conditions that will make capitalism unsustainable socially. Because at the moment, for example, to take the United States, there's absolutely no appetite for socialism. Socialism is a bad word. Even centrist policies, which are far from the left, are defined by these right-wing nuts, these Republicans who follow Trump, as communism and socialism. So there's a total absolute ignorance, but not only about socialism. So we're a long way away from, and the same things in Latin America. And we're a long way of bringing about, let's say, at the national level a program, policies and institutions that are supportive of a socialist approach to development. And it's partly because they have not been able to escape, let's say, the social contradiction, the inequalities which capitalism generates of necessity, the environmental contradiction, and political contradiction. On the question of development and resistance, my argument is this, that it is possible to trace out over time from the 15th century a series of cycles, development cycles, and each cycle, if you analyze it, generates new forces of resistance. So these cycles are composed of development and resistance cycles. When you change the development, you bring about new forces of resistance. And if you just analyze the evolution of this process of capital development, you can see that the transition from one cycle to another has depended on the form taken by the resistance. For example, in the 1980s, we have a new phase of the development. You have the earlier phase, developmentalism. That's referring to development from the 1940s to the 1980s, in which the resistance took a form of the labor movement and the land movement. And in the 1960s and 70s, these movements created very powerful forces of resistance that were eventually put down by the state. So in other words, these forces of resistance were just did not have the resources, the capacity to challenge capitalism. But at the same time, they forced capitalism to change. They forced to adopt a different form of development. So in the 1980s, in the neoliberal era, you have a new strategy of development based on the imposition of the neoliberal policy agenda. This is the result of the imperial state in the form of the World Bank and the IMF, which imposed these policies on governments and as a condition of getting access to capital, world capital. So, in other words, development changed its tactics, changed its approach, changed its goal, its objectives in the 80s. But it was the result of that was partly shaped by the form taken by the resistance. The resistance could not challenge capitalism, but it forced it to change its colors or its approach. And you can trace that out throughout the history of capital development. At each phase of development, the new force of resistance resulted in reshaping the form that development had taken until that point. So that's why you have to look at this as a dialectical process, the dynamics of development and resistance, and how they are, one leads to the other, how they're connected.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So I don't know if there's more questions here. I see the faces are and Miriam, do you have one? Andres, do you have one?
answers?
I have one question also. So Miriam, okay, we have three more questions, and we're gonna be concrete, so in order that we can finish soon, because yeah, here is late, but we are fascinated for your exposition, and all that you were explaining is an invitation to read you, to search you in internet. You have a lot of publication, and yes, this is an invitation for reading you after this conversation. So we're gonna hear the question from Miriam from here, from the public here in Eichstätt.
So thank you very much for your very inspiring talk. I would have a question concerning the terms global north and global south, which you used when you quickly traced the history of development. And yeah, I wanted to ask in which way are these terms an alternative to third world and first world, which the terms which were used originally in development discourses. Is this are these terms global north, global south really an alternative, or are they just other words to speak about the same and to continue the imperial division between center and periphery?
Okay, thank you, Miriam. Yes, Daniel.
Is it okay if I speak from here? I'm connected on Zoom.
But maybe
Can you hear me, Professor?
I should clarify that the relationship between countries on the north-south divide, in this new international division of labor, is an essential feature of not only extractivism, but of imperialism and capitalism. In other words, capitalism is essentially based on the capital-labor relation, which we all understand is based on economic exploitation. But the north-south divide between center and periphery is a different, at a different level, the same development. You know, it's the development of a structure that permits and allows and leads to economic exploitation. And at one level of the working class by the capitalist class, at another level by the advanced capitalist countries that basically manipulate and use the institutional and policy framework of the New World Order to advance its agenda. So it's based on exploitation, the exploitation of the so-called developing countries by countries at the center, which of course means that the rich countries at the center, its economic development, which results in benefits that is distributed to a large part of the population, which is being lifted out of poverty into the so-called middle class. So the middle class, to an extent, shares in the benefits derived from the exploitation of developing countries. That's unavoidable. That's the way the capitalist system works. It also means that the middle classes are, in countries such as Germany, the United States, and Canada, have a shared interest in the continuation of imperialism, imperialism and capitalism, because they share to some degree in their benefits. This makes it very, not impossible, but very difficult to generate an anti-capitalist resistance movement in countries in the north, when you're such a large part of the population that shares in the benefits of of economic exploitation. And I mean, it's a contradiction, which is a political contradiction, which is not impossible, but very difficult to solve. The real problem. That is the major political problem, which explains also the lack of relevance or the weakness, the incapacity of the left to develop as it has in past periods of development, an effective, let's say, resistance. Like in the 50s and 60s, 70s, the resistance to capital development was based on the labor movement, and the land movement. And the land movement was more powerful than labor movement. But in the end, in the 80s, both the labor movement and the land movement were destroyed by the forces of capitalist development, showing the weakness of the left, the incapacity to mount an effective resistance. So that's why I say it's a major political problem. Is the incapacity of the left to develop an effective resistance, which it can only do by uniting with the class struggle in the rural areas and on the extractive frontier. So you have three forces of resistance that somehow have to be combined. And the only way to do that is for the left to take the initiative.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So we have two questions more, one from Daniel here and one from me, from myself.
Short questions and short answers.
Short questions, short answers.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for your insightful presentation. My question is related to the first one. I was wondering, according to some analysts, it seems that the major powers of the so-called development era have lost interest in developing Latin America. Something that was happening during the post-war period. Of course, now we have new global players such as China and its large investments in the region. But I was wondering from your perspective, what has happened to the region's place in the comparative geography of development? Is it diminished, or perhaps are we in a more polycentric political scenario? Thank you.
But allow me, Professor, to make my questions. This is related in some way to what Daniel said. It's a kind of question and comment. In all these discussions about development, I think sometimes is the questions of the territorial regime of the option to the post-development is overlooked. So there are two options now in terms of how should looks the post-capitalist society in terms of the territorial form. I'm thinking on which is the form of the territorial organizations that would permit to live in a non-capitalist society. And there are two options, very politically very different. One option is the option of decentralizations or even the deconstruction of the state. And the other option is the options of talking about the initiatives like in BRICS, you see, the options of regionalizing. I don't know if you have some comments about these territorial dimensions of thinking about the development or the post-development.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of posing the problem. Look, I mentioned in my presentation that the indigenous communities on the extractive frontier constitute the most powerful forces of transformative change today. But that change is very limited to the local communities. Because there seems to be no political movement to connect a political agenda with this struggle, this anti-extractive struggle in the countryside. But yeah, it's very difficult. The solution might be to create a socialist state, a state that's committed to socialism. But we're well, the only we're far away from that, except in the case of Venezuela, which provides a model of that. But you know, the question is either to change the state or to transform it by through forces of resistance. But it's also possible to basically simply to disconnect from the state and for these local communities to concentrate on the development of their communities and not concern themselves or worry about the nature of the state, whether it's capitalist or socialist. And I think a lot of indigenous communities, this is how they look at the state. They look at the state as sort of powerless, weak, and they say it's better to disconnect from the state and concentrate on the development of their communities. So it's quite possible for, like I said, like the Zapatistas, to create an economy, to create a social and solidarity economy that works for the local community. And you don't need the umbrella of a state or that provides like an institutional framework. In other words, they can construct a form of socialist development. This is the socialism of the 21st century, as they see it, is to concentrate on the development of their communities and not concern themselves with linking up with the political left to help it take over the state. So their argument is, forget the state. We don't need it. We don't want it. So in other words, so the question then is, does development become localized and fragmented, and rather than unified? So that seems to be the problem. Does one count on the state as a major agency for development, or you bypass or ignore the state and focus on local development and local struggles?
Okay, Professor. I guess you have answered the whole questions. And as I told before, it's an invitation to read you to debate on these perspectives that you have. It's very interesting, very insightful. So from our side here in ISTED, just say thank you for your contributions to this debate, for this opening of the winter lecture series of the CELAS. And yeah, thank you to the attendees here, to the people that is connected in Zoom, and the people, of course, in Bogota. Andres, do you want to say goodbye from your side, from our side? We thank you, all of you, especially Professor.
Could I briefly just add one little point?
Okay.
I would like to thank you and everybody involved in this very interesting project. I liked it a lot. I've got quite a few articles and books over the last 10 years written on this topic. So I invite people, they're all available in PDF. So anyone who wants any of these book length publications, for example, they're quite welcome to them. I can make them available on a email request. Beyond that, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Very generous from your side.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you all you colleagues in Eichstätt, Daniel, Luis, Miriam, and I guess we are going to see us very often on a weekly basis.
Yes, and
Okay.
before closing this session, I remind you that we have in 7 days our second conference from the professor Dr. Francisco Rodriguez. The title of his lecture is Reassessment of the Cultural Cold War in Latin America, All Questions, New Sources. He is from the Extremadura University, and he will be here present in Eichstätt, in Silas. So thank you again, all of you, especially Professor Wellmeyer, and I hope that we see you connected again in our lectures. Thank
Yes.
you.
You might very well. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Dankeschön. Nos vemos entonces la semana entrante. Abrazos.
Excelente, gracias. Salió.